Hello everyone and welcome to the Dyslexia Life Hacks Show. I'm your host Matthew Head, and in this episode I'm talking to Dr. Robert Melillo. He has over 30 years experience as a clinician, professor, brain researcher and a best-selling author. He specialises in children and adults where he focuses on ADHD, autism, OCD, tics, anxiety and dyslexia. He's the developer of the Melillo method, and he's also the author of Disconnected Kids. As always, I'll put extended show notes and links to things we talk about in the show notes, which will be available at dyslexialifehacks.com/podcast. Where I'd like to kick this podcast off with is your interest in medicine and becoming a doctor in the first place. What really sparked you as a young person? Like, that's what I want to do.
Really, as a young person, I was very athletic. And I had a natural curiosity about exercise, and I got interested in exercise and diet and nutrition at a very young age. I also had a number of athletic injuries that required care, and so I found an interest in that. But it just, when I went to high school, I fell in love with anatomy and physiology, and then that's what made me decide I wanted to be in the healthcare field. I really gravitated more towards natural type of medicine and physical. So, my first interest was really when I was in graduate school, I fell in love with neurology. And so rehabilitation and neurology was always two of the main areas that I was interested in. And that's been the focus of my career now, really for 30 years. And then issues with my own children and my own children's issues with ADHD and dyslexia and autism led me to look at the development of the brain. And that is really, what I've focused a lot of my research on, is really looking at developmental neurology and the brain and what all these things are really from a neuroanatomical perspective.
So that was going to be my next question. Where did neurodiversity come into your life? And it sounds like your kids are where that really started. Were you aware of neurodiversity before you had children that were neurodiverse? No.
And we didn't really have a lot of, one of my books, my third book, is all about, this epidemic rise of ADHD and autism and many of these neurodevelopmental issues. And they've just increased dramatically. And 30 years ago, like for instance, autism was 1 in 10,000, and now it's 1 in 36, 1 in 24 boys.
Yeah.
It was always there to a certain degree, but that's increased dramatically as well. So, I really wasn't familiar with it, and I really wasn't that familiar with it or even interested that much in it until it really impacted my own children.
Yeah.
And then I wanted to learn more about it. And that became kind of an obsession with me. You really understanding, because when my older son, when he was diagnosed with ADHD, and it wasn't clear whether it was ADHD or dyslexia. There was a clear difference between those two in certain ways, neurologically. No one could really tell me what that meant in his brain, like what was actually happening in his brain. And at the point, I was already teaching clinical neurology and rehabilitation. I knew a lot about the brain. I was doing brain research. And so for me, that was the first question. What actually is happening in his brain? What is ADHD? What is dyslexia? What is autism? And even now, when I see patients, no matter what age, the first question I ask them is, has anybody explained to you what's happening in your brain or in your child's brain? And the answer is always no.
So how did you come to realize that your children were neurodiverse? What sort of started being the early signs? Sort of take me back to the days when you're kind of thinking, hang on, maybe we need to look deeper into their behavior or the outputs or whatever. You sort of rung, not alarm bells, but put signals in your head.
Yeah, my older son, one thing I said, I was a pretty good athlete. I had an athletic scholarship in college. So did my brother. My sister was a great athlete. Everybody in my family, all my nieces and nephews, are really good athletes. My older son, although seemed to have unbelievable balance, he would be climbing up on, a roof of a garage and at 3 years old, and people would go, "Hey, your kid's on the roof." And my wife would be like, "Okay, is that what they're not supposed to do?" And but it came to playing traditional sports like football or soccer. He was terrible.
Yeah.
He couldn't get it. His motor planning was so bad.
Yeah.
His balance And yeah, like he could skate, he could ride a bike early, but his ability to do multiple steps, he couldn't do that. He was definitely a bit hyperactive, but it didn't seem like it was abnormal. He was very friendly, very social, very creative from the very beginning. You know, my wife's an artist, so, you know, he kind of showed a lot of that in the beginning. But really, the fact that he struggled so much with motor planning and was so poorly coordinated was just unusual. I mean, my wife is a great dancer. It didn't make sense to me. And I wanted to understand, like, what is happening here? And then when he was diagnosed with ADHD, I was made, you know, aware that there may be a relationship between those two. And that relationship is what I wanted to understand more.
So did you sort of spotting these patterns, but what actually sort of drove you to get him diagnosed? Was there a particular person in your life that was like, it might be ADHD? Have you gone for a formal diagnosis with him, or is it you doing some reading around the subject and kind of narrowed it down?
It was two things. One is because I've always been, I've looked at things outside the box my whole career, trying to look at very innovative things. So I've always known about diet, nutrition, and many different types of approaches to the brain and the nervous system. My wife met this woman at a fundraiser who had a son with ADHD and autism spectrum. And so she invited her to come over my house, and I came home one day and saw that she was at my kitchen table and she was crying. I didn't know who this woman was. My wife introduced her and she said, you know, can you help her? And she told this woman, well, my husband knows, she had tried all the traditional medical medicine, psychology, and nothing worked. And she was very upset and frustrated. So my wife said, well, why don't you come talk to my husband? You know a lot about the brain and the nervous system and other things. So that kind of triggered it in me. And my wife, you know, I said to her, you know, I'm kind of busy right now. I don't really know if I have time to take this on. And she said, I have a feeling you're supposed to do something with this. This is important. And I said, okay. And then about 2-3 days later, I went to my son's first grade parent teacher meet. And the teacher said, I think your son has ADHD. You know, he's very creative and he's very sweet, but he's always moving. He won't sit down when the other children will sit down. And, you know, but, you know, I mean, I think there might be something going on here. So the combination of someone asking me to help their child and then have it impact my child, you know, that for me, and like most parents, at first, you know, I felt shame because I felt like, how did I not know this? How did I not see this in my child? I have to have a teacher tell me this. But then there was also the idea that maybe I caused this in some way, because parents always blame themselves because I was working a lot or whatever. But then I also, you know, heard my wife say, hey, you're supposed to do something with this. So I felt like, okay, this was something that, you know, was important. And so, you know, as a father, I dove in it. And as a professional, I became very, very curious in it. And it really fueled me. And I, you know, I looked at everything I could. I did all research. And you know, I put it all down in a book. It took me about 10 years to compile. I wrote the book literally by hand, 1,300 pages. 4,000 references. Of all the papers and books that I had read in that period of time. And by the end of it, I really felt like I knew what was happening in the brain as well as anybody in the world. And then I'd also been coming up with a way of changing it.
Yeah. So was that something you did on your spare time around your job, or did you manage to pivot your kind of clinical practice closer to working with neurodiversity?
Initially, it was something I did around my practice. Any day off, I would go to the medical school library. And at that point, you know, there weren't even really computers to go, or there was, but we weren't doing research on the internet. So I would literally go to a medical school library. I would go through journals and pull out papers and stand at a copy machine and copy them off and then read them and then come back home. And wherever I went, I was reading papers. And then I started incorporating some of this into my practice. So it was kind of an evolution. I would spend my time researching and stay up late at night and try to read and understand what was happening. And then I would also attend a lot of conferences on the subject on weekends. And then I would start to incorporate it in my treatment plan. And then it became something that I started actually teaching myself on a postgraduate level to other doctors and therapists. And then I got really heavily involved in the research end of it and the writing end of it. And so all of that kind of came together.
That's quite nice, isn't it, that you managed to pull all the threads together so your mind is focused on one broad area rather than having to switch out clinical practice into neurodiverse research and back again during the day and night. So
can I ask you a question? So we had talked about earlier about you being a dyslexic person.
I am, yeah.
I said earlier that a lot of the people that I talk to, the first thing I ask is, has anybody explained what's actually happening in your brain? So anybody explain to you neurologically what's actually happening in the brain of dyslexia or in your brain? Do you feel like you have a good understanding of that?
Yes and no. I know in theory that the sort of neurological wiring and I think it's synapses, the words, might not be wired the same as a neurotypical brain. Tend to be a visual thinker, so everything's in more in pictures rather than narrative, tends to be how I sort of think about it and work within the world. So a lot of kind of turning everything into imagery tends to be what I lean into, and that kind of is what works for me. But that's kind of, I guess that's the surface level, and obviously I have spoken to people who go into deeper, but that's kind of how I like to think of it, is the brain is wired and fires differently and tends to be more visually dominated rather than maybe narratively dominated, but not jumping out of my skin into one of my friend's skins that isn't dyslexic. I don't know for sure.
Right, but you don't really understand like the neuroanatomy of it. First of all, anybody that's in the neurodiverse world, for the most part, any patients that I work with, it starts with them being unusually gifted, usually talented in a particular area of their brain. And then we know, like with people with dyslexia, going back to some of the original research really in Harvard with two guys named Galiberta and Gershwin back in the late 70s, early 80s, that was the first real major study done on dyslexics. And they showed that, many of these people were very gifted in certain things like art, visual arts, athletics, that they had advanced what we call global processing, but they had trouble with detail processing. And, very clearly showed that neuroanatomically, there's a delay or an underdevelopment in the left side of the brain where there was an overactivity. There's what we call a reverse asymmetry of something called the planum temporale, which is one of the main areas that has to do with speech, where most people it's bigger on the left side, but in people with dyslexia, it was bigger on the right side. So, again, this is like my approach. And I think, you were getting to where you're going to start asking me, what do I do for this and everything. So I thought it would be a good idea.
You may have got ahead of me there, yeah.
Use an example of, how I think about this and how it relates to you, and looking at things like, there's a delay on the left side of the brain, but there's advanced skills on the right side of the brain. And that's really where all the research has been. Mm-hmm. And that's where the solution lies, right? I'm going to say that the idea that dyslexia is a lifelong problem that you can't change, I'm going to say it's completely untrue, because we've been able to objectively change that, meaning it's built on a trait, a personality trait, where the person is a very right brain dominant and they have many, many gifts that go along with that. My daughter is dyslexic, and I know this very, very well. But it doesn't have that, and this imbalance is where this lives, but you can change that and you can create equality, and you can actually get rid of the dyslexia or the reading or the word reading problem, which is the actual definition, without losing the gift. And we can get people that actually read better than other people or other kids their age.
Okay. So you're sort of using neuroplasticity and the sort of flexibility of the brain to bring it up.
Yeah, we're literally changing the brain. We're changing the function of the brain and the development and the maturity, because in general, there's no damage, there's no injury, there's nothing wrong with the brain, there's nothing wrong with the synapses. There's no genetic mutation that is responsible for dyslexia or any other major neurodevelopmental disorder. The problem is this developmental delay or imbalance where some areas of the brain may be. I'll give you an example. I just saw a child just today.
Yeah.
And this child, we did an academic achievement test called a Wyatt, which is the gold standard test in neuropsychology. And I also have a degree in neuropsychology. And what we see is that word reading is a left brain skill. And being deficient in basic word reading and or decoding is primarily the definition of dyslexia. It's not reversing letters or transposing words or letters that may come along with it, but it's really a word reading problem, usually a phonemic awareness problem. But basically, if your word reading is very slow and is more than 2 years below your age, that's how I classify dyslexia.
Right.
And so this child, reading comprehension is a right brain skill. So this child literally was 9 years old, 8 years old, comprehending. So reading at a second grade level. They were in fourth grade here, reading at a second grade level. So at around a 6-year-old level, 7-year-old, comprehending at a college level, comprehending at a 20-year-old level. So now, how does a child who's 2 years behind in word reading actually comprehend more than 10 years above what they should be able to comprehend? That is a child that is a right brain genius. That is incredible, but that child also fits the category of dyslexia.
Yeah. Yeah, but my particular strength is being able to comprehend more than I'm able to read.
Exactly, and that's the strength of everybody with dyslexia. If it's accurately diagnosed, right? Because there's other things that can cause reading issues, and some people have reading comprehension problems, are also labeled with dyslexia, but typically it's really more of their reading comprehension is usually advanced, and their word reading is usually very, very low, and they usually have poor spelling as well.
Oh, yes. Yeah, sympathise with all that. I've done a lot of work as an adult to be able to bring that back up, but yes. So you were doing all your research, reading and authoring your first book. Was there any particular moments you're like, that really sort of clicks things into place for you? Obviously, we've now cited on the difference neurologically in the brain, but was there any other kind of moments in stuff you were reading maybe on the fringes of research that were like, oh, this seems juicy?
Sure. Because I was involved in rehab and I did a lot of physical rehab and looking at neurology at the time. In rehabilitation, you're really looking at balancing things. And there was a movement, especially in spinal rehab, and in really which sparked the whole sports medicine thing, was looking at the function of the muscles relative to the joints. So if somebody injured a joint, or like a knee injury, it was clear that we could use ways of testing the muscle strength and endurance, and we could look at the ratio of the flexors versus the extensors. And when there was a proper ratio, a proper balance, that person would have a stable knee or would be healed of a knee injury, or that's what we saw in a normal knee. When people had injury, they would have a reversal of that, where their extensors would be stronger than their flexors or vice versa. And so we saw that in the spine as well. And so looking at these imbalances and looking at function rather than just symptoms was where I was already going clinically and what I was already teaching. When I first started reading on ADHD and many of these things and dyslexia, first thing that hit me was right off the bat that most of the researchers talked about an unevenness of skills, meaning that they weren't bad at everything. In fact, they were usually exceptional in certain things, like advanced, but also really struggling in others. And to me, it sounded like an imbalance, right? Which I was like, that's very interesting because that related to where my head was at the time.
Yeah, yeah.
So I started looking at it and I said, what are all the things that people with ADHD are really good at? And then what do they struggle with? And I noticed that everything that they were good at was a left brain skill, and everything that they were struggling with was a right brain skill. And so I kind of hit that. And then there were some researchers literally talking in those terms, saying that ADHD seemed to have more of an impact on the right side of the brain, where we have most of our attention networks and where we have more inhibitory control of motor activity and where we have more social awareness. And the left brain, seemed to be maybe generating hyperactivity. And then when I got to dyslexia, I saw that it was the exact opposite, that all the things that people that were dyslexic were good at were right brain skills, and all the things that they were struggling with were left brain skills. So when I started looking at this, again, from a rehab perspective, it made sense to me. And I looked at the brain like I would look at muscles or as the body and say, okay, so can we create more balance in the brain? And if we do, will that correct these issues? And that's really was the kind of aha moment for me, where it really related to me and where I was at and what I was thinking, and it made sense to me. And that's where I dove into that more. And that was even more, as I went down the road, it was proven more and more and more and more. And then as we started doing our own research, we were able to see that as well.
Yes, I like the sort of engineering sports science analogy that, muscle imbalance around the knee is not fun. So that does bring us nicely on to the Melillo method. And, you've already alluded to how the sort of methodology and the thinking behind it of rebalancing the brain, but, engineer by heart. So let's get into the specifics of it. How and what does the Melillo method look like?
Sure. Well, again, the thing I want people to think about is, when we talk about changing the brain, most people think, well, we need to take like a drug to change our brain, right? Even though drugs don't actually change the brain, meaning they have effect on the brain so that it can manage symptoms, but we know that they don't create neuroplasticity. So they don't actually physically change the brain. That's why you have to keep on taking them. They're not therapeutic. They don't deal with the core issue. At its root, none of these issues are biochemical imbalances. That doesn't exist, unless you have a genetic disease or something.
Okay.
But the brain, rather, the more, the way we think about it in more neuroscience is that the brain as an organ that really is, it does something, right? Every area of our brain controls a different skill. Some of those skills are sensory, where we take in vision or hearing and then we process it and then we need to integrate it. Some of them are motor, meaning that we do things, we need to move our body, we react in a certain way, we do certain things like speaking and nonverbal and verbal communication. We have different thinking skills, cognitive skills like attention, memory, working memory, short-term memory, long-term memory, doing math, concentrating, planning, setting goals, motivating ourselves. All of those things are different areas of our brain. And then our brain also regulates our body. It controls the balance of our autonomic system and our digestive system and our hormones. And the brain regulates every system. Every system is subservient to the brain. And if the brain doesn't develop appropriately, then any system can be involved. So the idea is that if we want to change the brain, we need to make the brain do something, and we need to be specific because we need to create balance in the brain. It's not just about massively stimulating the brain on both sides. It's about doing it in a directed way where we actually may have to inhibit certain sides, certain areas of the brain, and bring up others. And so, we'll do things like visual training or auditory training, or we'll do certain types of motor functions, or we'll do things only from the right side of the body, or only the right ear, or only the right eye, or only the left nostril if we want to stimulate the left brain. We'll do different, timing, coordination, movements to help improve the processing speed of the brain. And then, diet and nutrition usually plays a role in any of these things. And then there are cognitive skills. Literally, like I said, with someone with dyslexia, we want to work on word reading, not reading comprehension. We want to work on basic math operations, not problem solving or math reasoning. We want to work on, short-term memory or hyper detail focus. So it's about doing things and getting the brain. So we put together a program that's tailored to the individual person. And then we literally put them through a brain training program. And we use different types of electrical stimulus. We'll use lasers. We use all different types of things to activate and balance the brain out.
Wow, that's a fair tool set. Now, one of the things that piqued my interest initially, before we get into lasers, electrical things, and we could geek out on that, is diet. Now, I think quite a lot of people have a grasp of how diet negatively affects human performance if it's wrong, and how it can possibly be the other way around. But specifically for dyslexic individuals, what about diet maybe needs tweaking? I mean, having somebody who personally struggles with eating too much in the first place anyway. I'm always interested in this kind of thing.
Yeah. So, with most of these issues, as I said, it starts with an immaturity of the brain or a developmental imbalance. Mm-hmm. That usually is related to an increase in what we call the sympathetic nervous system or the fight or flight system.
Yeah.
And a delay in development of the parasympathetic system or the vagal system, what's called the rest and digest system. So most people, whether they have a right brain delay or left brain delay, they have some problems with digestion where they may, not really break down. They don't produce as much acid in their stomach, and maybe not as much digestive enzymes. Their gut may stay open and what we call leaky, which is more immature. We all start out life with a leaky gut, but it's supposed to close up in the first year. And then, this also has an impact on our immune system, where most people with left brain delays have a weaker immune system. They're more prone to chronic infections, people with right brain deficits tend to have an overactive. They tend more prone towards autoimmune issues. So we can get certain people might be able to have fungal infections in their gut, or like candida, or they may have bad bacteria in their gut. They may not be able to break down food, and they may develop food sensitivities. So that may be an individualized person, but they also may not have the proper blood flow, so that they have vitamin and mineral deficiencies. Now, the left brain, the two neurotransmitters that are more dominant in the left brain is dopamine and acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is very important for memory and learning, and dopamine is very important for motivation, what we call executive function, memory, cognitive functions. And so there are different neurotransmitters, there are different amino acids that are more specific for those neurotransmitters. I've created a vitamin that's specific for the left brain and a vitamin that's specific for the right brain. The right brain is more serotonin and norepinephrine. Both sides of the brain have what we call glutamate and GABA, but the left brain tends to have more glutamate and the right brain more GABA. So again, there are different foods, there are different things that we can eat, or different vitamin or mineral deficiencies that can impact one side more than the other.
Okay, so it'd be a specific sort of tailored kind of eating plan to each patient, I suppose. Yeah, okay. And that's interesting, actually, how I hadn't really thought about the left and right brain development driving the rest of the body, but of course it would do, wouldn't it? Why wouldn't it do things like that? It's the most important organ in the body.
And it's the one we know least about, right? So
yeah,
for most people, they know more about, obviously their gut and their heart and their liver, and than they do about their own brain. It's the most important organ we have, but most people have no idea. Are they more right brain or left brain dominant? Do they have an imbalance in their brain? But, we know that basically any sort of mental health issue in adults or children, it all starts in childhood. I'm sure your issues go back all the way to when you were a small child. And if we actually even looked at your first year of development, we may be able to pick up things that would let us have identified differences in muscle tone. And again, I asked you if I could use an example of you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what we see is that when people have imbalances in their brain, it often shows up in their body, in their muscle tone, and in their facial muscle tone, right?
Right. Okay.
So as I'm looking at you, I see that your left eye is probably twice the size of your right eye. I don't know if you've ever noticed that.
Probably not. No, I haven't. No.
Look at yourself on screen.
You're trying to without looking away from the camera, which is tricky.
Right.
Yeah, I can probably see what you mean. Yeah.
Take a picture of yourself. It'll really be obvious.
Yes.
And that would usually show up as having lower muscle tone on the left side of your face compared to the right.
Okay.
That usually starts with an imbalance in your brainstem that starts from the very beginning of life and has been there. If we look at pictures of you when you were a small child, I bet you we would still see that imbalance in your eye. And I don't know if anybody ever pointed it out, but to me, it's obviously very obvious, and I see it right away.
No.
And so, those are some of the things that we look at physically, but also things that we can change.
Right. Okay. So how would you go about changing that? I know we're going to have to talk generals and you are more about specifics, but just a kind of quick overview to give people a flavor, really.
Well, in the brainstem, and when we first start out life, the foundation of brain development, the brain builds from the bottom up. You're an engineer, so it's like building a building, okay? And then once we build that building in stages, the brain grows, and then it comes down and it regulates everything.
Yeah.
That's the way it's supposed to work.
Yeah.
Initial part of development, building the foundation of the brain, which is what we call the medulla, is happening right from the very beginning. And, human babies are very immature when they're born. Our brain is the most immature brain, and we don't have control of movement. But to build the brain, we have to move. So we're born with these things called primitive reflexes. These are basic baby reflexes that allow the baby to move themselves in the womb and get in position, help push themselves out of the womb, then roll over on their belly and back and forth, and then crawl on their belly and crawl on all fours, and then sit up and then stand up and then walk. And at 12 months, almost exactly, a child should walk. They should talk. They should be able to say a few words, and they should be pointing and have eye contact. And if they don't do that like that, then something went wrong. And usually it's because these reflexes aren't going away. At one, when a baby stands up and talks and walks and points, these reflexes should go away. And now the bottom of the brain is solid. The foundation has matured. And now we go on to the next stage, and then the next stage, and the next stage. If the reflexes don't go away, that bottom foundation of the brain has never been solidly built, and it stays in a more immature state.
Right.
And then this usually leads to an imbalance one way or the other. And as the brain builds, that imbalance usually gets worse. And that's where all the symptoms live, in that imbalance, one way or the other. And so the brainstem is also where the facial muscle nerves come from.
Right.
And that also is a reflection on the sympathetic and parasympathetic system. So that if there's facial asymmetry, we know there's an asymmetry in your brain development and in the foundation of your brain. There's also an asymmetry in your immune and digestive system, most likely. So, again, a lot of that is right there and really starts right from the beginning in development.
Interesting. Yeah. Building a house on slightly tricky foundations and how the asymmetry goes up. So I think we got kind of a good feeler, but I want to ask it anyway. If I was a new patient to your clinic. What are we looking for in the first session? I mean, you've already spotted some things via Zoom, via a camera. So you've got to start there. But what would the first kind of few sessions look like, just for people who are curious and might want to sort of do a couple of sessions with you? How does that look?
Well, the first thing I would do is obviously do a detailed history to learn more about your development going all the way back. I want you to, if your mom's still alive, I want to ask questions about what her pregnancy was like, what the delivery was like. Were you born by C-section? Were you born naturally? Did you have a breech presentation? And then looking at your milestones. Did you roll over? Did you crawl in your belly when you were supposed to? Did you sit up? Did you walk? Did you talk? Were you delayed in speaking in any way? Were you, did you have a lisp? Did you end up having speech therapy as a child? Did you struggle with reading right from the beginning? Did you have any learning disabilities or labels when you were a kid? All of those things, I'd go back and look at your health history, all of that. And then we do a comprehensive neurological physical exam. And one of the first things I'd look at is, again, do you still have some of these retained primitive reflexes? That's one of my main areas of research that I'm pretty much the world expert in right now. I've published more than anybody else in the world in this. And so we've been able to show that there's a direct relationship between these reflexes being retained and creating these imbalances, or what we call functional disconnections between networks in the brain. So we would do that. And if those reflexes are there, then the first thing we need to do is address that and get rid of them. But we also would look at your brain and see, do you have this typical type of, weakness and strength in different areas? So we would do a battery of tests. We do a cognitive test. We might do an academic test on you to look at your word reading level, like where is your word reading versus your reading comprehension, or what is your basic math versus your more, spatial math. We may do a battery of neurocognitive tests to look also at your memory and processing. Like you said, many people that are dyslexic, they have very good visual memory, but very poor verbal memory, or auditory memory may not be as good. With people with ADHD, it's the opposite. They may have really good visual memory, but terrible, or really good verbal memory, but terrible visual memory. Looking at your attention levels, and there's different, many people with dyslexia are diagnosed with ADHD, but neurologically, classic ADHD is the opposite of dyslexia. But there's 3 different types of ADHD. ADHD 1 is the inattentive type without hyperactivity or impulsivity. So we, want to go through that. And then we would also, look at certain lab tests to see if you have any vitamin deficiencies or inflammation in your body. And then we would also do a brain map where we do an EEG and we'd look at your brainwave patterns. We'd look at your timing and your coordination in your body, and look at all the different things that related to your hearing, your vision, your pupil responses, your sense of smell, your core stability, so we'd look at everything in your body. And then from there, we'd put together a plan to really, take wherever you were weaker and work on that, and actually maybe dampen down areas that might be overactive on you.
Oh, interesting. So dampen down stuff as well as lift stuff up to kind of get the balance right. And what sort of time frame would we be looking at? What sort of, I guess, when would the patient start positively feeling some results?
Well, we usually see results really quickly, usually within the first couple of weeks.
Oh, wow.
People with left brain delays and dyslexia, it may take longer for it to really show up, right? So being able to read is a later skill that may show up. So usually we're talking about the time frame of 6 months to a year. Usually in that range of 1 year, we can usually get a kid, let's say that's, dyslexic. We can usually get them to be reading at or above their grade level within 1 year. But it really depends on each person, and obviously if they follow through. We talk about dyslexia, and it's a very important problem, but along with dyslexia, anybody that's dyslexic, they have this unusual right brain strength. with that comes emotional reactivity. The right brain emotions are things like sadness, fear, embarrassment, shame, and guilt, rejection, sensitivity, but also empathy and love and attachment.
Mm-hmm.
So what we see is that, like my daughter, for example, she's basically dyslexic. She struggled with basic word reading and spelling. But as a kid, she wouldn't sleep at night. And I didn't know why until later on. She told us that she had this constant sense of fear and danger that something bad was going to happen, that I was going to die or my wife was going to die during the night, or someone would break into the house or there'd be a fire. And so she had this vigilance over this fear that something bad was going to happen.
Yeah.
And then she was hypersensitive to other people's emotions, so that it was overwhelming for her when she was a kid. And she also would feel guilt and shame even when she did nothing wrong.
Right.
But she also started writing songs that when she was 10 years of age that were unbelievable, like incredible emotional depth. And that's what she is. Now she's one of the best songwriters down in Nashville. She's a singer.
Nice.
Zach Brown of the Zach Brown Band produced her album. She opened for him last year. She's opening for Jason Aldean next week, I think. So, she's unbelievably talented musician. And so that's what I'm talking about. There's this gift that is deficit. She could barely read and spell, but she could write a song out of her head with words and music, even when she couldn't read or write music.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what she does for a living. That's obviously her gift. But, we were able to get her to be able to read at a normal level. And she went to college and she did well in school. But the biggest issue with her is the emotional sensitivity. There's something called metacognition, the ability to judge ourselves accurately. But the right brain, when it's dominant, it tends to overread other people, and it tends to judge ourselves negatively. And we tend to feel like other people are judging us negatively and that people don't like us, or they think we're, not smart or not talented. And, we beat ourselves up. We reduce our self-esteem is a real trouble, is a problem. And again, this leads to embarrassment or shame. And that's one of the biggest fears of people with right brain dominance or dyslexia, is the fear of embarrassment. And ultimately, it's a fear of rejection, right? Because that's the biggest fear. Because for humans, we have to get along with other people. And the right brain develops first, and we could not survive without other people. And so therefore, we must connect with other people. And the right brain is driven by that from the beginning. And kids with dyslexia, with left brain deficits, right brain strong, they're very social early on. But they may also be overwhelmed by other people's emotions. So that may make them a little shy. But most kids, when they're very young, they're very social. And they, want other people to desperately love them and like them and get along with them, because that is critical for survival, and the fear of being rejected. Because in the Stone Age, if you were rejected by your group, it was a death sentence. You literally would die. And there are some people with what we call rejection sensitivity dysphoria. If they get rejected, or if they get, made fun of on a social media group, they literally feel like they're going to die from it.
Yeah.
So that is actually even a bigger problem than the word reading or the learning disability, is the emotional reactivity. And the problem, that may set up bipolar or severe depression. Too much sadness and guilt and shame combined with the left brain generates joy and happiness and pride. Right? So if you lack pride in yourself and happiness, and you have shame and guilt, embarrassment and sadness, that is depression. And we have a lot of people and adults that we work with that are dyslexic. I have a young man who's 34 right now, who's with me here, and He's been dyslexic his whole life, but he was a very creative artist. He was a good athlete. He wanted to be a stand-up comedian. But he now is in such a depressed state that he's suicidal.
Oh. So there's a lot to work on with that before getting into any of the other stuff. But do you still take the same method with building up?
Yes. Right. But the emotional problem is more of a problem than the not being able to read, right?
Yeah,
but
definitely.
Also, the unusual gifts that come along with that. Thomas Edison was dyslexic.
Yeah.
Ed Sheeran is dyslexic.
Yeah.
They say 50% of people that work in NASA are dyslexic because their visual spatial skills are so good.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So that brings me on to sort of winding up the end of this podcast. Now, every guest that comes on the show gets 3 rapid fire questions from me. They don't necessarily need short answers from yourself. So let's dive into question number 1.
I love this.
What prejudice have you had about dyslexia that's been proven wrong?
Oh, absolutely. The fact that they're supposedly not intelligent. We know that actually the right brain is the more intelligent brain. The right brain, but because it doesn't speak, and we've been told that the left brain is the dominant brain and that the left brain is the intellect brain, and that because the left brain is more like a computer, it analyzes data, it collects data, it remembers data.
Yeah.
It can spit it out. We have kids that are autistic that their left brain is so good, they memorize everything, they can spit everything out, but they don't know what it means. They don't understand. So everything comes into the right brain first, and then it goes to the left and it's analyzed and it's collected and it's sorted and it put in a category. And then it goes back to the right brain for the right brain to fit it in and make that information useful. And
right.
The right brain processes all of this information instantaneously all at once. Just knows things. It doesn't speak because speaking is too slow. The right brain instantly knows things on a subconscious level intuitively. The left brain is slower. It has to analyze it and it has to line it up and look at it sequentially, one step at a time. And so we're led to believe in a left brain world that the left brain is the intelligent brain and that the right brain is the dumb and it's the mute brain, and that people that are dyslexic aren't very smart. It's the exact opposite. They're geniuses with their right brain, and the right brain is smarter and more intelligent than the left brain. But I think what we're doing is we're taking people that think so fast and holistically and all at once without words, and we try to jam them into a left brain world and say, it's like you have a kid, then you say, look at that math problem and what's the answer? And let's say they get it right. And then they say, okay, well, show me how you got that. I don't know how. And you have to make them read slowly. And when they look at something and they immediately understand, look at the whole thing and they know what it means. So I think what we're trying to do is dumb people down with the right brain and make their brain slower to fit into a left brain world. And I think that, so the fact that, that myth, I think is the biggest thing for me.
Yes, definitely. And a great sort of answer to that as well, going into the brain balance of that. So, rapid fire question number 2. If an alien landed and you had to describe dyslexia to them, how would you do it?
I'd say these are people that are incredibly gifted and have areas of their brain that are overactive in nonverbal communication, reading people, understanding, but they may be delayed in doing sequential type of things or detail things. They see the big picture, they can't see the trees, and there's this disconnect. And that is dyslexia. That's what it is.
Yes, great answer. So, last question is rapid fire set, and you're not allowed to promote your own method for this one. Seeing as this is the Dyslexia Life Hack show, what is your favorite dyslexia life hack?
That's a good question. My favorite dyslexia life hack. To me, it would be, trying to get people to do what they like, something they like, that normally may be hard for them. If we could get them to read things that they really enjoy, and do it in a way that is fun. Because that's, task avoidance is a big issue with dyslexia, that people, the left brain generates motivation, it sets goals, it pursues goals, it believes we can achieve a goal. And so, being able to motivate ourselves to do something that's difficult and hard, and something we don't like is very difficult. So if we can try to, make it so that we're doing things that, favor the strength, but get them to do things that are going to help their weakness. And a lot of it is by making it fun, making it interesting for them, giving them a lot of praise. I learned with my daughter a long time ago that I'd go see her sing when she was little, and I would never criticize her. All I would do was be a cheerleader for her, because she was always her own worst critic. And that I learned that, if you just be positive and really give them a lot of encouragement and make them feel good, that would give them the impetus to try to do things that they may normally not do and work through some of the issues.
Yes, definitely. So before we sign off, is there anything else you'd like to add, and where can people find you?
Yeah, no, this is something that's very important. Like I said, I personally struggle with it and understand that, this is a very important thing, and the emotional component of this. But the main thing is that, for me, of course, acceptance of neurodiversity is very important, acceptance of people. We're not trying to change people. We're trying to actually just bring out the best version of them. And if there are severe imbalances that lead to diagnoses, then that person is not the best version of themselves. And so for me, understanding that this can change, that people do not have to live lifelong with a disability, that they have this unusual gift, and that's where it all starts. But we can take away the disability without diminishing the gift. And that is what we want to give to people, where everything is great and you don't have these struggles. It doesn't mean that we want to change the person or lose their personality in any way. We just want to get rid of the disability, and it's important to understand that you can, and it's possible.
Yeah.
And Dr. Robert Melillo, MELILLO.com is my website. I have very active Instagram at Dr. Robert Melillo. We put a lot of things out there. I have, I think, over 800 people on that, and we put a lot of information out there. My book, Disconnected Kids, is one of the best-selling books in the world. We just came out with the 3rd edition just about a month ago, and that's been translated into 18 languages, and it's a real manual for people to use for themselves or their children, to be able to help them just by buying a $10 book. There's a lot of other things out there. My wife and I did a web series called Disconnected Kids, Reconnected Families. I have 8 best-selling books, and I have over 100 scientific papers, and I also have a textbook. So there's a lot of things out there for people to learn more about this.
Excellent. Well, I'll drop links to all of that kind of stuff in the show notes as well. And that just leaves me to thank you very much, Robert, for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you. It's great.
And I want to thank everybody else for taking the time to listen, and I'll speak to you in the next episode. Bye for now.